Today on The Global African, we've got a great treat. We'll talk with Danny Glover and James Early about the election outcomes in Venezuela. Then we'll give an update on what's going on in the Western Sahara. That's Today on The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher. Thanks for joining us. On December 6th, there was a political earthquake that was felt throughout the Western Hemisphere. The Venezuelan elections led to a decisive defeat of the government party and coalition by an opposition that, ever since the emergence of Hugo Chavez and his movement, has attempted to reverse every reform that has been introduced by the Bolivarian government. Today, we're going to explore what happened. We're going to look at the issue of Venezuela, and we're going to look at the question of the impact or potential impact that this election has on African descendants, not simply in Venezuela, but in the Western Hemisphere, because it is the Bolivarian government of Venezuela that increasingly has raised or called attention to issues facing African descendants in the Western Hemisphere. We're joined for this segment by Danny Glover and James Early. Danny Glover, of course, is a great U.S. film actor, director, and activist. He's also the co-founder and CEO of Louverture Films. James Early is a scholar and member of the board of the Institute for Policy Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to The Global African.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So I want to start this with an analysis of the Venezuelan elections. Virtually everybody was predicting that the opposition was going to do well. The question was, by how much? And I wondered if the two of you were surprised by the extent of the opposition victory, and what do you make of it?
I am surprised by the extent of the victory in terms of the two-thirds supermajority that they now have in the House and the political implications of what they can do with that. Underneath that, however, in terms of the day-to-day politics, it was a lot closer in terms of the differences of why people voted. Many people voted not for the opposition, but against the government. Many of those
They wanted to punish the government.
Well, I wouldn't even say they want to punish the government. Mm-hmm. These are people, many of them, who've been pulled out of poverty, and now they want to have services. They have been set up over the last 16 years by what Hugo Chavez started out of dire poverty, out of lack of participation, to become an active citizenry, and had great expectations that now they could improve the quality of their lives. The failure of the government to deal with inflation, the currency exchange, things of that sort was frustrating. And so it was not punishment. It was saying, we want politics to be practical. We can't eat ideology. So it's unclear in this 20-party united front of the opposition of to what extent they're going to be able to wield a unified politic. And it may open up different kinds of coalitions around different kinds of policies in line with the left government. So it's going to be a battle both on the ground and both in the National Assembly.
It certainly has been a disappointment for all of us who remain supportive of the Bolivarian Revolution and the changes that we saw firsthand up front that were happening in Venezuela, the relationship, evolving relationship between the Venezuelan state and Afro-descendants, et cetera, was so important. We also noticed that it seemed that even during every election, there were certain things that occurred. There were shortages, always shortages before election, even when the elections with Chavez and elections that the party won and that the left won. It seems as if that something has happened, and James talked about around the new calculus that is forming in Venezuela. And whenever you have the changes that happen with the Chavista government, you're going to have greater expectations among just ordinary people. Their expectations are going to be expectations, as James alluded to, that they now are empowered as citizens. They have another relationship with governance as in civil society that they hadn't had before. So all these are dynamics that certainly are wielded now within this whole process. We have to understand, become vigilant in terms of the things in our support of what changes are occurring. And what changes continue to change. This may be a process in which we see that the ground could be the fertile ground for even a greater expansion of some of the ideals of President Chavez and the Chavistas, but it also is an opportunity for us to really lose ground. I'm not so sure, as James has said, how much ground we've really lost, and what were the other dynamics that have happened. That's certainly beyond the political dynamics that are going to happen in this restructuring right now, temporary restructuring.
So we're dealing with a situation where a conservative has taken over Argentina. We have a right wing in Venezuela, a right wing coalition. We have efforts to move. In fact, some people calling for a coup in Brazil. Is this coincidence? Is this just bad timing or what?
I think there are a number of objective factors that come into play, but these objective factors should not obscure what may be the errors and the failures on the part of the left, but in terms of the objective factors. When you look at Latin America, one of the most dynamic areas in the world, the most dynamic area in the world that has taken on neoliberalism, privatization, deregulation, lower role of the state in the interest of the people. These governments have redistributed resources towards the poor. They have the highest indices of the reduction of poverty based on the UN Millennium Goals, which now have been extended to 2030 because they were so significant. But these are export governments. They have the same kind of economies that they had under colonialism. China, which has been the biggest consumer, the manufacturing heart of the globe now, has turned its model around. Rather than importing, it is producing internally for its own citizens, so it is not buying as much. Mm-hmm. The price of oil has dropped tremendously. Oil is now around $31 a barrel. It's expected to go somewhere between $20 and $25 a barrel. The Saudis can produce oil for $8 a barrel. Fracking produces oil for $20 to $25 a barrel in the U.S. So oil, in terms of Brazil, Venezuela, the largest oil reserve in the world, it has been devastating. 60% or so of its economy was based on that, and the surplus allowed for lifting people out of poverty. Third largest oil resource in the world is Brazil. They, too, are facing this global kind of change. So that the global crisis of capitalism has compounded the failures and errors that left governments have also done. So it's not coincidental of what's happening with Dilma Rousseff, the call for. I mean, this is really frightening, this fascist development. We're seeing one ripple of that in the United States with Donald Trump and the coddling of him, notwithstanding some useful criticism from the status quo. It is still a coddling of a fascist who is really basing himself on the fears of a large social base who are feeling these same global effects in the economy. But because of the ultranationalism here, the United States first, they don't really have an articulation of what are these global factors going on.
Well, I was actually going to ask you both about one part of that, something that I've been wondering. In a situation of a country that's relying so heavily on extractive industries, to what extent were we able to see, whether in Venezuela, Ecuador, other places, an attempt to reshift the economy? Well,
I think one of the things, and James has talked about this, one of the degrees is still, the question is under these various forms of social democracies, how much can be done? What can be done as long as power resides in those in money and capital. And there's certainly the question that was a major question. What's attributed to all these economies, whether it's Venezuela or what's in Brazil, with all these movements, and these are popular movements from the ground up. What is attributed to them is the fact that they pulled each of those countries out of its kind of deep crisis at the time. That certainly the expansion of social services and healthcare in Venezuela in particular had a major impact on some of the things that we're talking about in terms of some of the victories of the Chavistas and everything else. Also, we can look at Brazil and say the same thing. Some of the changes happened at that particular moment where it seemed as if capital, in the sense, allowed for its own rescue, allowed for some of these changes to happen. The question is now, in the real sense, did in a sense, as that further the crisis of capitalism deeper, did they now begin to pull back the reins? And that may be the major question, is how much we can get done under the current systems. And so, and as you said, there were no appreciative change in the power structure within the systems that exist and that these governments had to operate in.
And this is a critical challenge and positive criticism that I think has to be brought to the left. Diversification. The dependency on extractive industries. So Korea and Ecuador, one of the most progressive, ran into big problems with indigenous communities and environmentalists because of the continuing move around extractive industries. Here's one of the ironies. A report has just come out from the UN that the largest exporter of food, the region that exports more food than any region in the world, is not any longer the United States of America. It's Latin America. Argentina ranks in the top 4 or 5 grain-producing areas of the world. Brazil, probably the largest in beef. The question and Danny used a very good term. We use the term left, about socialist. Some of these governments are socialist. Like Cuba, like the government of Venezuela, like Nicaragua, like Bolivia. But the economies, save Cuba, are capitalist.
Do we have any ideas as to how Afro-descendant populations, communities voted?
Not in this. I don't have the facts in this recent election, but I do have, as a result of an inquiry just 4 weeks ago, that in every election from '99, all of the concentrated areas of Afro-descendants voted unanimously for the Chavez policies. And I will find out more about this recent election, but I don't have a breakout at this point.
Now,
well, we certainly, when we were involved in the 2012, is it 2012 or 2000, the last election for President Chavez, 2012 election, the first places we went after the election was to Barlovento, and certainly they were, in a sense, relieved that Chavez had won the presidential election, and presented us a demonstration of the work that they had been doing in building their collectives, and their co-ops. So yeah, I mean, I can imagine that they voted heavily in those areas, Afro-descendant areas, with the party itself.
That, despite the fact that there has been constant criticism of government officials called out by name who do not address the issue of Afro-descendants. So on the one hand, there's been a unified movement on the part of Afro-descendants to support the general direction of 21st century socialism. On the other hand, the government's function has been inconsistent in addressing the particular needs of these communities. That, unfortunately, is characteristic throughout this hemisphere, including in the United States of America, but very pronounced all over Latin America, including socialist Cuba, in my view, of which a lot of people don't want to face up to those issues.
We are out of time, so I want to thank you both for taking the time to join us on the show today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us for this segment of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher, and we'll be back in a moment. After the Spanish withdrew from what had been their colony of the Spanish Sahara in 1975, the now Western Sahara was quickly claimed by neighboring countries, specifically Morocco and Mauritania, leaving the Sahrawi people displaced and vulnerable, and in fact ignoring their right to self-determination. In 1979, Mauritania relinquished its side of the territory, and Morocco took claim to the entirety of the Western Sahara without any international support. Today, the United Nations recognizes the territory as a non-self-governing territory, calling it Africa's last colony. Sahrawi rebel liberation movement, known as the Polisario Front, seeks to end Morocco's presence in the Western Sahara. In 1991, the United Nations brokered a ceasefire in the hopes to put the Western Sahara's independence to a vote. But, as to today, Morocco refuses to comply with the peace plan that it signed, believing its claim to the land is rooted in history. Moroccan King Mohammed VI told a Spanish newsletter, quote, "Those who are waiting for any other concessions on Morocco's part are deceiving themselves," unquote. The international community has not been active in resolving this issue, grouping it with so-called forgotten conflicts. Today we're going to look at the latest on the Western Sahara's quest for liberation. We're also going to look specifically in the upcoming Congress of the Polisario Front, the liberation movement of the Sahrawi people. So stay tuned. We're joined for this segment with Dr. Stephen Zunes, who is a professor of politics and international studies at the University of San Francisco, where he serves as the coordinator of the program in Middle Eastern Studies. Dr. Zunes, welcome to the Global African.
Great to be with you.
Or I should say, welcome back. So the liberation movement in the Western Sahara, in Northwest Africa, is having a Congress this month. And it is my understanding that there are major issues facing the Congress, including and especially the growing frustration on the actual situation, given that the Moroccans have, in effect, undermined every effort at self-determination on the part of the Sahrawis since the 1991 ceasefire.
Well, frustrations are indeed mounting. As you mentioned, the Polisario Front, the National Liberation Movement of Western Sahara, which is recognized as the government of the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. This is a nation state that's a full member of the African Union, and is recognized by more than 80 nations as an independent state, but has nevertheless been occupied by Morocco for over 40 years. They've pretty much done everything right in the sense that they have upheld the provisions of the 1991 ceasefire, but Morocco has not gone through with their end of the bargain. That is to have a free and fair internationally supervised referendum choosing between independence and some form of integration with the Moroccan kingdom. There's a younger generation many of whom have grown up in the refugee camps, as well as people under the brutal Moroccan occupation inside the occupied territory that are saying, well, since Morocco didn't go through their end of the bargain, we should no longer live up to our end of the bargain, which is the suspension of the armed struggle. And that could, and then while certainly people under colonialism, which is essentially what we're talking about here, under foreign belligerent occupation, however you want to word it, do have the legal right, and one could argue the moral right, to armed resistance.
You mentioned that the Moroccan state is quite strong. It seems like they're quite strong in large part because of the backing that they're getting from France. Is that correct?
Yeah, very, very much so. They are former colonial possession of France. They remain in what one could call a neo-colonial relationship right now. French business interests are very strong. I would also say that the United States has, not as much as France, but has certainly been a strong supporter of Morocco, somewhat less so under the Obama administration. But what we see among both the Republican candidates and Hillary Clinton, the leading Democratic candidate, I think the more ambivalent stance by the Obama administration is going to be supplanted by a more hardline pro-monarchy perspective after President Obama steps down.
You know, Professor, one of the things that I've tried to understand about the United States and its role in this whole conflict is that the former Secretary of State, James Baker, from the George H.W. Bush administration, was a mediator in this dispute. And he ended up resigning out of utter frustration on about the attitude of the Moroccans. Now, James Baker is about as establishment as they come. I mean, it wasn't like they sent me over there to mediate. I mean, this is someone from the ruling elite. He is essentially humiliated by the Moroccans, and yet the Moroccans don't seem to pay any penalty. And can you help explain this?
This is particularly ironic since James Baker, as the principal attorney during the disputed results in the Florida election back in 2000, that he played a major role in allowing George W. Bush to become president. And yet Bush and his administration rejected Baker's findings on Morocco and Western Sahara, basically continued to back the Moroccan government to the hilt. And indeed, it's kind of interesting that while you certainly have some liberal Democrats, particularly members of the Black Caucus, that are sympathetic with the right of self-determination, you also have a number of Republicans, some fairly conservative ones even, that are also sympathetic, from knowing Mr. Baker, who served both as a former Secretary of State, former Secretary of the Treasury, former Chief of Staff of previous Republican administrations. There's actually some bipartisan support for self-determination. But there's also, unfortunately, bipartisan support, more powerful bipartisan support for the occupation. I think it comes down to really the history of the United States and supporting allied regimes, even when they violate basic international norms. We certainly saw this in supporting Indonesia's occupation of East Timor. If you go back a few years, South Africa's occupation of Namibia. And indeed, the Israeli occupation. I've always argued it's not just AIPAC. Unfortunately, the United States has a history of supporting allied countries invade, occupy, colonize, and oppress weaker neighbors. And I think Morocco is just another example of this. We see Morocco initially as a bulwark against the alleged communist threat during the Cold War, and now we see them as a bulwark against the supposed Islamic threat.
Now, you mentioned a minute ago about the Congressional Black Caucus in the United States. And while it is true that some members of the Congressional Black Caucus have spoken in favor of Sahrawi self-determination, this doesn't appear to be one of their top issues. What do you make of that?
Of course, given some of the districts that most members of the Congressional Black Caucus represent, obviously they have a lot of priorities in terms of meeting the needs of their constituents in the face of cutbacks in social programs, police violence, and so many of the issues that affect the African American community. Mm-hmm. And so historically, African Americans have not tended, members of Congress have not been involved in for example, the House, Foreign Relations Committee or other, foreign policy issues. Even though they take the right position much more often than on average than most white members of Congress, is not foreign policy in general has not been a huge priority. And given that Western Sahara is a fairly obscure issue compared to other foreign policy issues, it's not surprising that it's even made become a lesser priority. The late Donald Payne, congressman from New Jersey, did some very good work on this. He was on the Africa Subcommittee of the House Foreign Relations Committee. He actually invited me to testify on a number of occasions. I mean, but he died a few years ago, and so far there really hasn't been anyone to have really taken the lead since then.
Dr. Zunas, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of The Global African.
My pleasure.
And thank you for joining us for this episode of The Global African. I'm your host, Bill Fletcher. Thank you.